Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Master Gardener program, Too Many Deer. I'm Dina Henshin, Head of Adult Services at Percival Library, and your host today. Please feel free to send me your comments and questions during the program by using the chat feature, and I will relay them during the question and answer time at the end of the program. Bernd Blossey directs the Ecology and Management of Invasive Plants program at Cornell University. An ever-increasing focus of his team are investigations into impacts of multiple stressors, including invasive and native plants, earthworms, slugs, and deer on a wide range of native organisms. The aim of his work is to increase the conservation values of all lands through the development of best management practices. Welcome, Bernd.
Thank you, Dina. Hello, everybody. There may be a few glitches here with my bandwidth at home, so I apologize for that in advance if some of the slides are not coming in quickly. Dina, interrupt me if I'm way off. Okay.
I will do that.
Thank you very much. So, what you should be having on your screen is a whole bunch of deer, and the question then is that too many? And are they having an effect on local fauna and flora? And how do we know it's actually deer that are causing this and not some other things, pollution, climate change, or whatever else you may have in your toolbox as potential changes that cause changes in the landscape? And then if we agree it's the deer, can we do something about it? Now we'll see whether I can actually advance this entire thing. Before, something should pop up on your screen, lots of pretty pictures of different organisms. But how I wanted to start today is that I wanted to tell you a little bit about me, where I'm coming from, and what my personal philosophy, ethics, and attitudes are about this entire situation. So I think words and the way that we choose to use them matter. And so I'm going to go into a few of them here. Hunting for me is not a sport. There are no game animals. It involves taking the lives of animals. That's not a sport. That neither is it the game or the organisms that lose their life. Animals whose pelts are sold are not fur bearers. There are mammals. Once again, if you use the word fur bearer, it basically means they are there for our purposes, and I have strong objections to that use of language. Wolves and mountain lions should be allowed to return. I'm talking about that hopefully at the end a little bit. And then something that I can't get into it, animals and plants and insects have language and culture. So we as humans are not unique in this world. And we need to recognize that, and very often we do not. I'm doing the things that I'm doing, so I'm advancing a slide. Did it advance, Dina?
Not yet, but the last one was slightly delayed, so I'm going to give it a couple seconds.
Okay, all right. So I can still talk until the pretty pictures show up, hopefully. I compressed them a lot, but maybe people can see some of that. So I do care about and want to protect native species and ecosystems. And so I manage deer to prevent negative ecological and to some extent economic impacts. But I'm working largely in lands that are set aside for conservation purposes. I do not work in agriculture, although some of the things around here where we do deer management are obviously used by farmers or Cornell University. And here are some other things. Did it advance, Dina? Sorry for it. I'm going to try to see.
You're okay. It did. I think there's just going to be that slight delay, and that's okay.
Okay, good.
You can just.
All right. So we're making some reasonable progress here. So that's good.
And this one just advanced to where it's supposed to be. So yeah, we're
okay.
Fine.
Perfect. So I apologize for interjecting, but it's going to be helpful for me to recognize that you're actually seeing what I'm talking about. You're looking at the same screen. So for me, humans are part of nature. Ecosystems and biotic communities have changed over time. Where I'm sitting right now, 10, 12, 15,000 years ago, there were woolly mammoths running over the hillsides where I'm sitting here right now outside of Ithaca. Humans, we have shaped and are shaped by the species around us. and our environments. So we're very flexible as a species. We can live in the Arctic and we can live in the deserts, but we adapt to that. So at the same time, we shape the species that are there, sometimes by hunting them to extinction, sometimes releasing them, like here the wolf releases in Yellowstone National Park as a rewilding thing. Sometimes we cause extinctions, like for the passenger pigeon here in the middle. Sometimes we try to restore coral reefs with active restoration. And we all do all that because we recognize, or many of us, maybe most of us, recognize that human well-being is linked to healthy ecosystems. If the ecosystem are sick, humans will be sick and will not thrive. This all goes back to something that maybe Aldo Leopold has called a land ethic. And so he talks about the individual responsibility for the health of the land. He kind of weaseled himself out of really well defining it for us. I will do a little bit of that in a moment. But health is the capacity of the land for self-renewal. And conservation is our effort to understand and preserve this capacity. It's probably as good as it gets for me to describe how I'm trying to approach what I'm doing. And when I'm talking about conservation, I'm using the word demography a lot. You may hear that multiple times today. And so I've tried to put a little thing in here what demography is. It's basically the study and statistics of how births and deaths for any organisms, whether that's humans, an oak tree, or a bluebird, or a trillium, are affected by different factors, whether that's disease or predation, or the number of seeds or eggs that are laid by an organism and the offspring that comes from that. And important to fulfill a life cycle is that you can go from being an adult to an egg to a chick to a juvenile for the bluebirds, from an acorn to a seedling to a sapling to a big old tree that may be 300 or 400 or 500 years old. Or for a trillium, from a flowering plant to a seed, to a small cotyledon, to a one-leaf one, to a small three-leaf plant, and a large three-leaf, and then finally flowering. We call these areas, as species go from one stage to the other, transitions. And each of these different stages have different things that may be affecting them. There are different things that are affecting an acorn versus an adult tree. So a turkey under a tree may not do much other than eating the acorn. So the acorn's losing their life, so to speak, if you want to. So it's important that all of these life stages are enabled if we want to conserve landscapes and species. If one of them misses out, the entire cycle breaks down. And when we look at landscape, these are landscapes here from New York. And when we see a lack of understory, I don't know where you are, whether you have situations like this where everything is browsed out and the understory is very depauperate. We're lacking a shrub layer, or there are no herbaceous species out there. That transition from a small seed to a small juvenile, or for a tree from an acorn to a seedling to a sapling, is no longer enabled. So these are unhealthy landscapes. They don't support well-being of species in the woods or humans. I put a slide in here from a pickleweed in the pond that I have here that the deer are going in like moose and eating out. So there is another part that's not a forest species, but they are as well negatively affected. So we have unhealthy landscapes. I think we can clearly see this as a deer effect, but some people may not want to admit that or think it's differently. So when we summarize everything that we know about deer, here, deer are at the center of a human health, economic, and an ecological crisis. That goes from the slide on the top left, which is the biodiversity preserve for the university in Binghamton. There's nothing there. Everything is browsed out. You can clearly see the browse line. No herbaceous species in there. There's lots of worms and ticks there. Pollinators have no way to live in there. In the middle is a beautiful trillium display in Wisconsin, but that was like 20, 30 years ago. I don't have a follow-up slide, but Deer are also responsible by changing the way that nature would maybe help us in combating the climate crisis by eliminating forest regeneration. So we losing the capacity to capture carbon. Deer facilitate earthworm invasions. So we changing decomposition process. There's a whole bunch of things that are changing, and it's all triggered by not by just deer, but by the high abundance of deer. So we need to distinguish deer as an organism that is native and has a role in the landscape from too many deer, right? So the question then is, can we somehow determine what too many are? So what do we really know? Deer are ecosystem engineers. They're the key for Lyme disease, for example. There's no Lyme in New York City until the deer started arriving in Staten Island. There's a long-term study in Connecticut that showed if you reduce deer abundance, Lyme disease, ticks will go not away, but go way down, and Lyme disease in people goes down. And deer reduction reduces or eliminates Lyme disease. We have done that on islands and in the Connecticut study. So deer are responsible for ecological deteriorations. There's thousands of studies. There's really not new evidence needed. The question then that is always asked, and you may wonder that for the area that you are working in and trying to steward, how do we know that the effects occur in your area, so locally, and affect your neighborhoods and plants and birds and insects? You can always point to studies, oh yeah, people up in New York and around Ithaca has done this, or in Wisconsin they have done this, or in Washington State do have done it. Does that happen in your neighborhood in Virginia? And how do we know? So how can you convince the skeptics? And how do deer interact with other stressors, including climate change? There's lots of work that needs to be done there, but they clearly do. And as I mentioned that already, what level of deer reduction or population size is needed to then reduce these negative effects that are not appreciated by us and other organisms? And then how do we know that deer are responsible? So there are chronosequences, so studies over time. And sometimes these effects take a very, very long time. If you think about how long it takes for a little seedling to develop into a sapling and then into a mature oak tree, that can be hundreds of years. There's the forest inventory analysis. People in the Forest Service the Federal Forest Service have done lots of research plots where they go in and it's like a 5-year rotation where they measure everything that's there. They have not done really the browse intensity, but they can document what is happening to their seedlings and saplings. Establishing a good control is hard. Very often we use fences, and I'm going to present some data about that. But it's not a good representation. We would like to know how much do we need to reduce deer to have a healthy environment, not exclude deer entirely, but that may be the only thing that's possible. And then really we don't have a good comparison anywhere in the US with low deer populations, maybe in the deep woods of northern Maine, Vermont, and New Hampshire, where deer are not being subsidized by agriculture and gardening, so the abundances are a little lower. But then there's also a different climate, is an entirely forested area, so it's kind of difficult to compare to suburban or urban neighborhoods. As I said, fencing is something that we can do, but it basically gets the number of deer per unit area to 0. And then we can have direct browse measures. I mentioned a number of different things here. The problem, if you go out and you look at some of these browse measures, very often they want to measure what's there right now. If you think about the slides that I showed you before, where there's basically nothing left, how can you understand what the deer are doing? I mean, there's very little that you can measure, or it's out of deer browse height. So we've developed a system what I call sentinel planting, which is basically going out and putting things out there and then recording what the deer are eating or how many of them they're eating. That allows citizen participation, and there's local evidence collection. You don't need a PhD for that. And so hopefully we can advance that a little more. Right now we're using red oaks seedlings that we grow from acorns. You will see some slides about that as well. So the FIA data, the forest inventory data that I said before, I have done it on a regional scale. So you're included in there. You can kind of see it at the map where it's Mid-Atlantic and New England states. And so can you see this?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so here on the left, really, it's the average numbers of seedlings that people record in these FIA plots per meter square. And so you can kind of see what is dark green is the best, and it's kind of restricted here to northern Maine. But overall, there's a whole bunch of seedlings that are being produced because you have plenty of old trees in the woods. But the seedlings don't make it out of browse height. There's even a lack of seedling. These are the shaded, the gray areas where very, very few seedlings even survive. Once you go into the saplings, so that's the next size class, sometimes they may be out of deer browse height. Most of the mid-Atlantic states, New York included, Pennsylvania, lack that sapling abundance. So the forests are not regenerating despite an abundant production of seeds. So that has been done. It happens in the national parks, it happens in the national monuments, and you can kind of see this is really, really widespread. So there is no future for the forests in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic in your area if we don't do something about it. And this is just for trees, tree seedlings and sapling. Just imagine, and here's another picture here from Lansing here outside New York. There's nothing in the understory, so the herbaceous species that don't have a vertical escape, meaning they can't grow that tall that the deer don't browse them anymore. They just don't have an escape in terms of height, so they're hammered even more. And we can sometimes record something. So I hope this works. So these are planted oaks that we put out. And then we put a video camera out. And it doesn't take many deer to take down the oaks that we planted and put a camera out. I don't know, there's a 6, 7 oak seedlings. Oops, she sees something is happening. Was that okay? Did that work okay, Dana?
Yes, it did.
Okay, all right. So it doesn't take many deer to eat a whole bunch of oaks, right? That's or 5, 6, 7 or whatever. That's a 20-second clip. And you can see that deer goes from seedling to seedling. And if you plant these out and you want oak regeneration, this is not working in a place where you have too many deer. John Kelly, I think it's in New Jersey, he studied that and he looked at the number of deer per square kilometer and what the saplings are doing per hectare. And you can kind of see where the deer numbers need to be. There's some uncertainty about the deer numbers because this is spotlight surveys. They are not that indicative, but you need to be really way under 20 deer per square kilometer to have saplings that are actually regenerating. And in most of the US, that's not happening. And I'm pretty sure that in your area, that's not happening. So when we think about the number of deer, typically, if we wanted to do a good experiment, you would like to have different abundances or different density of deer in a known area. So the Forest Service tried that in Virginia, and they did it's called the Allegheny deer experiment. So they put deer behind fences at different density, did some clear cutting and some others, and then followed them up. The problem was that at the high deer densities that they created, the deer were starting to starve. They always wanted to get out, and fences always break. So they had a problem with maintaining animals healthy at higher distances at higher densities. So after 10 years, they abandoned that. But some work came out of that one. And so here at the bottom, you kind of see the deer per square kilometer when they did this work from basically 1979 to 1990. And so the function is very clear. The more deer you have, and here they go only to basically 25 deer per square kilometer. Remember where Kelly was with needed to be under 20 to maintain saplings, regenerate saplings. So this is the tree species diversity. And you can kind of see that the tree species diversity is declining the more deer you have. As the tree species are declining, the caterpillar density declines to really low levels. That then creates a problem for birds that want to feed their young with all the insects that are eating the foliage and the diversity that's there. And so you have the bird species declines. And so this is pretty low. Well, it's very high abundance, but this is much lower than we typically have in the landscape, which is more, so that's 60 per square mile equivalent. Here outside Cornell University, we have a lovely little community that we're fighting over deer management for a very long time, Cayuga Heights. They had 50 deer per square kilometer. So you can kind of imagine that not much is able to survive there. So here we have one of the few examples where people were actually manipulating deer density and trying to understand what the effects are. And then we can go and document browse, not just with the video that I showed you before, but you can go out and look at the deer. Here's an example of ginseng that is being browsed off. These flags that I have put out at every browse trillium. Sometimes it's very, very difficult to document what is not there because it's not visually clear. So what I did here was I went through that and followed a path that one deer had taken, or maybe it was a couple of deer. So every of these flags, that's over 100 of white and lime green flags, was a flowering trillium. You can almost imagine how a deer walked through there and just nibbled that off. It may have been just a family. That's what we lose when there should be flowering trilliums throughout the entire area. Deer also affect plant invasions, and that may be important for you. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but when you fence deer out, garlic mustard goes away, and so does Japanese stilt grass. So there's one on the left, one on the right. They also go away even if you do not fence them out. With fencing, it happens even faster. Garlic mustard, if you do not control it, will go away through negative soil feedback. I don't have the time to really go into that one, but deer are keeping them in the landscape longer. The proportion of plants, so this is a study that we are conducting here on our land. Typically what we would think, and people have done some modeling about this. So this is white and red trillium here. And these are different years, and we know from some models that if 15% of the flowering individuals are browsed, that population is declining. So these are the demographic and modeling aspects of what you can see. And you can see for the white trilliums, in most year the deer are eating more than the 15%. There obviously is some annual fluctuation, depends on winters and others, where the deer are not eating that many. If you think about the red trillium, every single year that we have assessed them, there's just a 7-year time period that's reflected here for the red trilliums. The deer are eating more trillium flowering individuals than the population can sustain. So these populations are shrinking over time. And what you can also see is that the browse intensity differs between very closely related plants in the same area. Here's another example in an area that we fenced. So this is for false Solomon seal. And so we just looked at the number of flowering individuals after 7 years of protection in the same area. Of the individuals that were there, 57 were flowering, 7 where the deer had access. The number of seeds was more than twice as large because the individuals are larger, so they have more resources to produce more seeds. So the number of seeds per flower here was much larger than the unprotected one, and that amounts to an enormous difference in the number of seeds that are being produced. So this has obviously consequences, right? For dispersal, for population maintenance, and everything else. So the magnitude of the effect that the deer are having is pretty gigantic here for false Solomon seal. I'm going to jump ahead, not going to go into the details. Very often, vegetation communities are sorted out because deer have been in the area for a very long time. So if you just put a fence out and don't do anything, and then you look at the vegetation community, very little will change because the ones that can exist with high deer populations are there, and they are being maintained, and may take 20, 30 years for communities to shift. So if somebody goes out and says, I want to study what the deer are doing, you put a fence around an area and don't do anything else, don't get light in or others, the vegetation will not change much over time. It takes a very, very long time. If we convince ourselves that the deer are a problem, what can we do about it? There are lethal and non-lethal methods. People have different preferences, and different things are possible in various ways. So there is hunting and culling as lethal methods. And the non-lethal ones are from shipping them somewhere where they're wanted. There is no such place. Learning to live with it, that may not be acceptable if you care about the species that are losing house and home. And then there's sterilization. And I'm going to address them in a little bit. So we did a big study at Cornell. When we wanted to reduce deer numbers at Cornell, there was an uproar by some people in the community. Said, oh, you need to do something different. So we studied what would happen when you sterilize the does, and we sterilized 90% of the does around campus. We had an area that was hunted. We had an area that was not hunted. We captured all of them and put wonderful ear tags on them so we could individually recognize them. And we had radio transmitters, GPS collars on them. Actually, this was not GPS, they were radio collars. So we had a technician run around and trying to find out where they are. We put camera traps out. We tried to understand that. Too much to go into the details. It's all available if you want to. This is all open access. So we have camera traps. We have our oak sentinels that I'm going to show you in a moment out there, trying to understand what's actually happened if you do sterilization. And this was done at the vet school with ovarectomies, because if you do tubal ligations, the deer are growing around the ligation site, and they will have babies or fawns afterwards again. So we wanted to understand what the effect is, not just what the abundance is of the deer with sterilization, how many we sterilized. By the way, we sterilized over 90% of the doe population. That's unheard of. Was a $500,000 project that was done by Paul Curtis and Jay Boulanger. And this is our Oak Sentinel project. So you can grow red oaks pretty easily by collecting acorns in the fall, store them in a refrigerator or cool room, wake them up a little sooner, grow them up to 15, 20 centimeters tall. You can do it by the thousands, as you can see here. You can plant them out, and we did it in cages and outside cages. And then we went in and measured the browse intensity. The only thing that you really need is a drill and a guy or a woman who's willing to put some sweat equity down. You can put them in. Establishment rates as 100%, and then you can see that the ones in the cages are doing pretty well. We have them all individually marked. You can kind of see there's a metal tag with that, and those that are exposed to deer, they will be eaten. And the question is, how many of them are being eaten? So here is an over time situation. So we plant them out late May, early June, kind of when the plants start to grow here in the woods. And it doesn't take much. You can remember how quick that deer ate the oak seedlings that we planted out. And within a month, this is the Leopold Woods. And so basically they go down, they eat almost 100%. So this is done before we really started deer reductions. This is another site. We did it at over 20 sites. And so within 2 months of planting, most of the individuals have disappeared unless you protect them, right? So the sites are okay. Oaks will be able to grow there, but it's the deer that are actually eliminating. So this is evidence for us that the deer are actually the change agent here. So what about sterilization and hunting, and where we didn't do anything, no sterilization or nothing. So these are the survival rates of the oaks, the ones that are not browsed. And you can see in cages, occasionally somebody dies. That's kind of understandable, but over 80% or around 80% in cages were surviving. There was no difference in the areas where we did sterilization or hunting or none of the above. The open ones are the ones that are exposed to deer, and you can see where it's being hunted. It's a slight improvement of the survival rates, but really, once you start testing that, it's not significant. So sterilization doesn't do anything. Hunting does very little, and the control is about as good as sterilization. So these recreational hunting, sterilization on. So what we did was a gigantic failure. So the question then is, maybe Cornell is not good. You heard me talk about Cayuga Heights before, and we did a large experiment around Ithaca trying to understand how hunting pressure may be affecting the browse rates of the oaks. So Cayuga Heights, Cornell, this is Finger Lakes Land Trust, state parks. This is something where we put large deer excluders out. It's called Atkinson Center. So it's a sponsor there. This is where I work. This is our little hillside farm where we looked at the white trilliums. And here is the browse rate on white trilliums. So this is called bobble and kill. We know that about 15% of the oaks, if they are browsed or less than that, that is slightly okay. And the hunting pressure increases from left to right. So what you can see, the browse rates are going down, but they're not going down enough to actually allow oaks to regenerate, with the exception at our property on Bobolink Hill. So this is good. We can regenerate oaks. The problem, though, is that while we can regenerate oaks here without doing without fencing them, the white trilliums and the red trilliums are still hammered. So we can't work with the herbaceous ones. We need to get the deer numbers even further down. And recognize that I'm not talking about deer numbers, because assessing number of deer is really, really difficult unless you have a marked population, which we had at Cornell, so we could study that. So we then implemented something in New York. These things, there are special permits that are called deer depredation permits, or DDPs. So what we did, baiting is also not allowed typically in New York. We put feed out in the fall through the winter, and we use volunteer bow hunters or crossbow hunters who then shoot the deer over bait, including at night. So we can do this with special permission. There's a small group of participants. You can kind of see what we do. We guide the deer so they are broadside to a tree stand. We have an automatic feeder. So every evening, half an hour before dark, corn is dispensed. This is just at the start of a baiting program so that you condition the deer to come in. There's always an open buffet. You can kind of come out and see that the deer are coming in, and then they're being taken. We do that in small woodlots or backyards. We can do it from September to April. I refuse to shoot the deer when they're lactating, even though the DEC, our management agency, would give us permits to that. I feel that's ethically unacceptable for me. We train the participants. We have tracking dogs so that we can recover the deer that are lethally hit and not immediately found. We have a code of conduct, so people need to behave in certain ways. We donate the venison to food banks or other charitable organization. And for us, it takes about 3 to 5 hours per deer to shoot one of sitting in a tree stand. In the recreational hunting program, including with guns, it takes 50 to 60 hours. So this is really, really effective. It works really well. It has a very, very high acceptance rate by the individuals that providing us access in their gardens and yards. Doing this at Cornell, we were able to not only assess the numbers because we have marked individuals, but also what's happened to the deer over time. So what you see here on the left side of the dashed screen is the number of deer that we know are around core campus. This is before we implemented the shooting over bait program here in 2013. You can kind of see this is the number of deer that were taken out of the population, both by hunters and by cars. So we could track the car vehicle accidents with our marked individuals. I can tell you that the cars are actually more, lethal or efficient in removing deer than the hunters. It's almost an even split. But the number of deer that we knew we had on campus always fluctuate around 90 to 100 with some variation in there, obviously. until we started using our program here, and that's shooting over bait and at night. And we were able to reduce the population down. Then it went back up with immigration from the city of Ithaca that doesn't have a program, or from surrounding areas. But we were able to reduce the deer population doing what we're doing. And over time, that went down even further. This is the number of individuals that were killed in the city of Ithaca in 2017. That's almost more than twice as many as we killed with hunters in the core management area around Cornell. And those deaths were not very nice. And Ithaca is largely 30 miles an hour because it's a city. So what then happened to our oak browse? And so this is a little confusing here because it's not clear. It's not, the years are going from right, which is the earliest, to left, which is the latest where we did. So this is the proportion of oaks that were browsed. And so when we started doing this in 2010, we had about 100 deer on campus. Then it dropped down to 90. When it dropped down to 60 and then 50, you could see that the proportion of oaks that were browsed over a year went way down. So this is a good indication for us that using oaks as an indicator of how much browse there is a very good assessment of how important deer are in the landscape and whether you need to reduce them further or not to get to something. What we did is still over 20% of the oaks were browsed. We need to halve that. And so we were largely unable to do that with the methods that we are deploying. And we were the small island, so the donut hole where the deer go to die, but then they all come from the surrounding areas and recolonize the Cornell campus. What we learned doing this is that suburban and rural landscapes are under severe deer pressure. And these threats are poorly known or recognized because you don't see the browse things, the things that are not able to live there. We blame some other things, introduced plants or pollution or whatever you have. The non-lethal methods that we have show absolutely no promise, no matter what the people are telling you. Yes, you can maybe not kill the deer directly, but they will continue to eat, and at some point they're going to be killed by cars. Recreational hunting is not able to reduce the deer populations to ecological acceptable levels. We tried all the tools that we have in our toolbox. We were just not able to do it. So the deer reductions then when you do sterilization may occur through vehicle collisions, and overall the available toolkit that we have is still rather limited. So the recommendations that we have is that we should abandon the non-lethal methods. Recreational hunting is okay. I'm not saying we should stop that, but it's not sufficient. And most of the hunters that go out there actually shoot a buck and not a female, which would be a much better way to reduce deer populations. Bucks don't count really in terms of demography. Just a few bucks out there will breed all the does that are around. We think regulated market hunting needs to be added to the mix to reduce populations, but that in itself is going to be good enough, and whether it would work in a suburban environment needs to be evaluated. It's really difficult to envision that this would happen everywhere. Large predators may help, so wolves and mountain lions, once deer populations are greatly reduced, but right now it's basically impossible. There are too many deer for wolves to eat them and reduce the populations. We've done some studies, I can't get into them on, but be prepared and adjust. So even if you would have wolves all over Virginia and mountain lions, that will not help you reduce the deer populations to acceptable levels. So as I said early on, they should be returning and we should be learning to live with them, but not because they will help us manage the deer populations. What we should require is that effectiveness of deer management as prescribed by your management agencies and municipalities should be assessed for their effectiveness. Just opinions are not enough. All the management agencies will tell you recreational hunting is good and sufficient. That's not true. There may be new methods that need to be developed, and they should actually embrace that. It's their responsibility. Why is it not happening? Leopold already talked about it. That's almost 60, 70 years ago. but tradition and institutional arrangements, the hunters and the agency, hand in hand, prevent some of the changes that are needed. Well-organized minority groups, hunters and animal welfare activists, are actually yelling at each other and preventing anything from really moving in the right direction. Local governments, municipalities do not see species other than humans, so ecosystem protections as their priority. Very unfortunate, but they may need to embrace stewardship more than they do now. Conflicts avoidance, just no politician wants to be yelled at all the time, just makes the status quo endure. So that just means deer will do what they're doing right now, and over time they will erode the biodiversity assets that are still there. So that's not, for me, it's not acceptable if you want to be good stewards or conservationists. The reality is this, right? So there are, Jim Sturber and others have called it deer wars, nature wars, all kinds of things are there. And so the yelling and screaming continues and nothing changes for now. And so I think there's a lot of effort that needs to be done to come to a more reasonable debate. We're not alone in this, because high abundance of browsers and grazers is happening almost around the world, at least in what we will call the global north, so the wealthy countries, Australia, all over Europe, New Zealand, North America, not so much in developing countries where maybe hunting and poaching of wildlife is more of a threat to these wildlife populations. But we share these things with kangaroos and camels in Australia, deer in Scotland, and all over Europe, or then as introduced species, horses and camels and donkeys all over the place. Pigs as well. So, Dina, can you tell me, should I stop? I can jump ahead and not go through some of the things that I have prepared to allow a discussion.
Yeah, so we have about 10 minutes if you want to jump ahead a little bit so that we have enough time to ask you a few questions. That would be great.
Yeah. So let me just see. What I wanted to show you is this. So we did, because I talked about the yelling and screaming that goes on between the hunters and the animal rights activists. So these are very well-funded and organized groups, but together they may be making up only 15-20% of the population. So what we did, we tried to understand what the attitude is in New York, and we did a similar study in Scotland, and then we did a survey of areas in the Pacific Northwest and the Intermountain West, Midwest, and then also the Northeast. What's the attitudes of people about if you reduce deer populations to decrease Lyme disease, increase road safety, decrease deer starvation, help forests being protected, or for climate change? And so what you see, so these are thousands of people that answered our survey. I'm just showing you this for New York. And there's incredible agreement that deer populations, and that's with lethal means, should be reduced to achieve all these things: Lyme disease reduction, road safety, climate change, protection of wild plants, all of these things. More than 2/3 of people will say, yes, please do that. It's not so much for increasing hunting opportunities or protecting the plants in your gardens, right? So there's very limited support. Interesting enough for us, rural and urban residents agree on this. There's no difference among them. There's no difference in the US regions about it. And hunters will agree with this one too. So what we hear from hunting organizations, or those tell us they speak for hunters, that's not true. So the acceptance of predators is much less. So here's what I want to wrap up with. There's overwhelming public support to manage deer in accordance with ecological and economic interest or health. The loud voices of special interest group are preventing appropriate action, and you have the stalemate. We still underestimate true deer impacts. No habitat appears safe. The deer crises are human-made, so I believe humans have a moral responsibility to be better stewards. Deer just do what deer do. We can't blame it, and I don't know. The individual animal welfare is important, but should not override larger conservation and species interests. Implementation and assessment challenges are large, they remain, but I believe they are solvable with some ingenuity and tests. Getting the political and agency world or change the tradition will require some heavy lifting by all of us. In the end, the choice of what we want in a landscape is largely driven by what we want. Do we want a diversified landscape with lots of birds and deer? Or do we want lots of deer and nothing in the forest understory, plus invasive honeysuckle and other invasive plants in that? With that, I encourage all of you to enjoy the wildlife and all of it, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernd. I have a few questions for you if you have a moment.
Absolutely.
Okay. Somebody is asking, are deer populations not affected by the declining availability of browse, or are feed sources expanding by species and into home gardens?
Yes, they are affected by it, but they are not affected by it in a way that populations are collapsing. So what we see is that if you talk to hunters, let's say very often in the hunting magazines, or so they call the old timers, right? People that lived in the 50s and 60s said, oh my God, there were deer everywhere and there were big deer out there. Now we see fewer deer. And so what they often result or revert to is that let's not shoot the females so that they can produce more fawns and then we have more deer to see. Actually, what it is exactly right. It's nutritional limitation. We see that. We see it in the decline of the size of the bucks. We see it in the decline of the size of the does. We see a decline in birth rates. So the number of fawns produced per doe. But in agricultural or suburban landscapes, we are replanting every year. I don't know how often you replant in your gardens. That's why deer love suburbia, right? So they eat something and something else will be planted in its way and they will eat it again. Yes, nutritional limitation is there. And if the deer browse themselves out of house and home, populations are going down. But we subsidize them with forestry operation, cutting, new sprouts are growing up, or with agriculture, soybeans, corn, everything else, or our gardens. So we're messing up the self-regulation of the system to a large extent.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, does the Department of the Interior have any state grants for these specialized hunting techniques?
So USDA Wildlife Services does some of these culling programs, right? And they typically go with sharpshooters. So Rock Creek Park, I believe, which is not that far from where you are in DC, uses sharpshooters. And I think it's USDA Wildlife Services. There are other organizations like White Buffalo that does some of that. What we do here is just with volunteers. We don't have extra funding for that. Where USDA Wildlife Services in your state may have some support, but typically they are being paid by municipalities. There is no grant support to really go out to do that I'm aware of. There may be a few subsidies, but there's nothing there for a municipality to go out and help us out when we write a grant.
Okay. Somebody asked, should we promote the use of venison as food? Is prion disease an issue for this?
It is what? What was the last part of the question?
Is prion, I don't know if I'm saying that right, it's Prion disease an
Oh,
issue?
prion. Oh, yeah. That's chronic wasting disease.
Oh, okay.
No, there's no evidence to suggest that gets into the human food chain for now. So I'm not concerned about chronic wasting disease or prion diseases if you don't eat the diseased animals and their brains, right? So there are precautions that you can have. Should we promote eating wild foods? Absolutely. But how are you going to get to it is a question, right? So should we increase the number of recreational hunters? That would be one way, but I think we need to change the way that recreational hunters are actually looking at their responsibility, not just as a hobby, but maybe as a social responsibility to shoot the females, not just the ones that have antlers on their head. That's a situation. It's an interesting thing for us, and believe me, I'm working with some people that work in food science and others that we encourage the foraging and the eating of wild meat while meat consumption overall is declining. So it's a little bit of a tricky business. I have people in my group and in my environment who said, I'm not going to eat any meat, but I'm eating venison as long as it was taken and not on a farm. The venison that you can buy right now, which you can, is typically from deer farms or New Zealand because you can't sell venison that a hunter shoots right now. So yes, but it's a little tricky to promote all that.
Okay. Can protections of seedling species be advanced in some way to allow to get taller to avoid the capability of deer to reach them?
Yes, the trick for all of that, and the Forest Service and the foresters do it all the time, which is fencing. So it's physical protection because we can't really have anything that will protect the deer from. I'm sorry, will protect the plants from a few hungry deer that may get in into your what you did in terms of the restoration. Fencing is the only way. That's also what I say about if you have wildflower populations where you still have some good populations, but these are orchids or trilliums or anything that would be considered deer candy, fence them so you can protect the individual so that they can flower, that they can protect, can produce some seeds. Those are the core requirements for population to expand outside the areas where they are now. If we get the deer numbers down, we need to protect those flowering individuals, those adult individuals, whether these are trees or herbaceous plants. That's important. There's nothing else that we can do other than fencing.
All right. I think you talked a little bit about this, but are coyotes and bears reducing deer populations? The way you made it sound was it does help, but it's not enough. Is that
No, it's
correct?
not even helping.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
what is happening to all the so they bears are particularly important. They kill a lot of fawns, but it doesn't have a demographic effect, right? So what that means is while they're killing a lot of deer, and so do coyotes, particularly the weakened ones or the ones that get hit by a car or something like that, but it doesn't trigger a population decline. That's over much of the years. Even for wolves, that doesn't happen. So there are some stories about coyotes being responsible for some deer population declines in Georgia, but it's also in a place where the forests are in very, very poor shape. The deer are a little smaller, but that's one small little island where maybe something like that is happening. I can't totally reject that. People have published about it, but in general, you can compare it to all of you will enjoy the song of the robins. Maybe they're singing already where you are. They started peeping around here now. And so you know that most baby robins will grow up on earthworms. And so, but that doesn't mean that the robins are controlling the earthworm populations. I wish they would. So it's the same thing. You can think about cars. There are many, many more deer that are being killed by cars than are being killed by coyotes and bears combined. But it doesn't reduce the population. It kills a whole bunch of individuals, but it's not enough.
Okay. I'm going to do two quick last questions and then I'll let you go. And I've got many thank yous in the chat, and this has been a great presentation. But these last two questions, one is, why does deer reduction result in reduced levels of Japanese stilt grass and garlic mustard?
Yeah.
That's
If you,
one.
whoever the person um, is who asked that question, if you can figure it out, we would be very grateful for that. There are two, we haven't fully understood why it is, but we know there are probably two factors that are involved in it. One is, and actually the same happens for swallowwort. I don't know whether you have swallowwort down there, black and pale swallowwort. Maybe that's more of a northern group of species. But so when you have high deer populations that favor introduced earthworm populations, introduced earthworm populations favor garlic mustard and favor Japanese stiltgrass. So that's one. If you fence it over time, earthworm populations go down and it may be then also triggering things in the soil that stress the garlic mustard and stiltgrass. We are not the only ones that have observed that, so that's very commonly observed now. Euphens, microstegium, and garlic mustard go down. The other effect is that the deer are eating their competitors, right? So you have garlic mustard maybe growing with a whole bunch of native plants. If the deer are taking out the native plants, garlic mustard has a better ability to be competitive. So there are these two opposing forces. There may be other things with microbial communities. We know that garlic mustard is very vulnerable to what's called negative soil feedback. So it goes away, but if you take out the deer, it doesn't go away, but it goes down to very low numbers and where it's no longer an ecological problem. And if you fence out the deer, that happens even faster. So there's still some questions that we do not know. We know that the processes are occurring, and not just here, in many different places.
All right, last question. Can you imagine legislation changes to allow market sale of wild harvested venison, and what impact might this have on populations if hunters are incentivized in this way?
So I'm going to give you a number of answers. Market hunting was there until the late 1800s. So a lot of people making a business out of going out to the Midwest, shooting bison or deer or passenger pigeon, shipping them with the rails to the cities in the east or to Chicago. That resulted in almost eradication of deer. So we know it can be done. It was a different landscape at that time, right? So that's possible. So we know that can happen. Can it happen in a landscape that is so carved up with individual property owners, where you just can't go into every lot in the suburban areas and start shooting the deer? That's not possible. You need permission. Will it be economically feasible for individuals to do that? I'm not sure, but it should be tried. That's probably not the only method that needs to be deployed. Market hunting is allowed for an introduced species in Hawaii for axis deer. So that's already something that is possible. It's within state legislations that needs to happen. And then there are some health things that USDA, because that is part of the food regulation, right? Which butchers can actually process venison, others. There need to be some regulations that need to be changed. Can it happen? Yes, we're pushing for it in many different places. And I can tell you that management agencies are actively considering it, because they can't, some of the new generations of managers that are coming in that are not so closely tied to hunting interests, they realize they can't manage deer populations. They can give out as many permits as they want, and it's the same number of deer that are being shot every year, and they can't increase the number of deer that are being shot. About 1 point a little bit per hunter per year. So they just shoot one for the freezer, and that's it. That's their recreation, right? It's their hobby. And so they're considering market hunting, but it's some heavy lifting because of the entrenched interests that you have there. I can envision that would be really, really helpful. And lots of people are pushing for it. So maybe we're not that far away from it. That would alleviate the deer population problem that we're having? I'm not convinced that it is, but it's an important tool to actually deploy.
Excellent. Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much, Bernd, for the presentation. It was wonderful. And there's so much research in there. It was great.
So did it advance okay, or was that just a little?
Well, the first couple slides, it was a little delayed, but then it got going normal. So we were good.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. That makes me very happy.
And I did record this presentation, so this will be being shared on the Loudoun County Public Library YouTube channel. I'll also send it to Claire Cornelius, who's the Master Gardener representative that I work with. And we will be having our next Master Gardener program in April. So keep your eyes on the event calendar. And thank you all for coming. And thank you again, Bernd.